Hi guys, welcome back to Hilltop Farm. I'm Jay and welcome back to another Sunday Soapbox. It's been a long time since I've done a Sunday Soapbox. Anyway, what's my Sunday Soapbox about? Well, it started the other night, and this is something that I have been thinking about. I've even discussed it with my family in recent weeks. But the other night I was watching a YouTuber that I've watched for a very, very long time. A lady called Bev, who has a channel, My Half Acre Homestead. Our Half Acre Homestead. And most of you probably have heard of her, and you'll either love her or you hate her, but whether you love her or hate her is really irrelevant. The one thing you can say about her is she's not afraid to stand up and be counted. She's not afraid to voice her opinion and to point out what she considers to be an injustice in the world. And whether you agree with what she's saying or not, you've got to admire her passion. But I do agree with her on this. She was making the statement, she didn't know whether she would call it patriotism or nationalism or protectionism. I think in many ways it comes under all banners, really. But what it is, she's been talking about the current world situation with the dreaded virus and how it's affected us all and how it's affected all countries. Now, one thing it's done for us here at Hilltop Farm is it's given us a little insight into how we're doing things, and it's shown up some flaws in the way we've done things. For example, our extended pantry. There are some things in our extended pantry that we realise we're carrying 4 or 5, 6 of a particular item. And not only is that item, it's not something that we're going to necessarily run out of in a hurry, but it's not something that you desperately are going to need in a crisis. I think we've all been surprised by the amount of craziness that's gone on in our supermarkets, and shelves being cleared, and some products you expect will be cleared, and then there are other products that you think, hang on a minute, why are we clearing the shelves on that? Toilet paper, for example. This is not a virus that I'm aware that causes diarrhea or anything, so I don't see why everyone needs to panic and have, mounds and mounds of toilet paper, but apparently they do. But anyway, it just showed us that we have to review our extended pantry and perhaps not keep as many of some things, but increase, and in some cases increase considerably, the amount of things we have in other areas. It would have been nice to not have to go anywhere near any shops whatsoever in the last 2 or 3 months. But our extended pantry wasn't equipped well enough to do that. It was for 95% of things. There was still the odd thing we had to go out for. So it's good the world situation is good in that regard. It has given us a practice run, if you like, and helped us iron out some kinks in our little system. But that's not what Bev's video has been about. Bev's video is about countries that are prepared in much the same way as the individual is not prepared. We have been so used to relying on other countries for various products or for various services that when we're in this situation, we're not prepared. We can't cope, and we should be able to cope. Most countries should be able to cope without the assistance of other countries in these situations, particularly in ridiculous situations. I actually raised a point because Bev in her video talks about the cotton industry in the US and how Canada, which is where she lives, is reliant on that industry, and they don't need to be, but they are. And it brought to mind a situation that we have here in Australia, just as an example. When I was growing up, in the 60s and 70s, lamb was a staple part of people's diets. People had lamb chops and vegetables, for their evening meal. Lamb chops were always included on a barbecue, and a leg of lamb was commonplace for your Sunday roast. They even ran an ad campaign specifically in the 80s about having lamb roasts, and there was a famous one when they talked where someone had the choice of going home for a lamb roast or going on a date with Tom Cruise, and they chose the lamb roast, and I can remember that specifically. So that's what we grew up on, and that was normal. We used to have mutton available at the supermarkets. Mutton being a sheep, it was just older, and it was much cheaper than lamb. When we first got married, it was cheaper to buy mutton than lamb, and my wife would buy a leg of mutton and she'd just cook it slower for longer, and you wouldn't even know the difference. It was not tough, melted in your mouth, it was lovely. But then, and I don't know exactly when this happened, I don't know whether it was the 80s or the 90s or when it happened, but they started live sheep exports, and they were sending the sheep, I think, to the Middle East, Africa. To be honest, I'm not clear on it because it upsets me, and so I'll be honest, I'm one of those people that because it upsets me, I tend not to look into it too much. But the whole live sheep export or live animal export is a whole nother issue here in Australia. There's a lot of people protests about it. I mean, we belong to a group that for protection of animals that are actively campaigning against it. But that's another issue. I'm not talking about that specifically. But the fact that they've obviously made a situation whereby the majority of farmers just can't say no. It's more economically viable for them to sell to these live export people who export it to another country where it gets slaughtered and whatever. But it's pushed the price of lamb through the roof to the point where most people don't have, certainly most households don't eat lamb for an evening meal like through the week. Most households these days wouldn't have it on a barbecue. And only a select few on special occasions would have a lamb roast. Because people cannot afford it. It's cheaper in many cases to have beef. It's quarter the price to have chicken. And even pork, which used to be the more expensive way to go. Even that's cheaper. So this is a perfect case of an industry, and if anyone who lives in Australia or has been here and travelled in the country will tell you, this country has got so many sheep, it is not funny. It's the one animal, with the exception of kangaroos, that we're overrun with. And we pay these ridiculous prices for the meat. And that, as I say, is because of the live export trade. We should be looking after Australia first. Australians, the average Australian, should be able to afford to put lamb on the table for their families all the time. Just the same price as chicken and other things. It has to be done, and it could be done, because there are sheep everywhere. Absolutely everywhere in Australia. Okay, there are fields down the end of our road on the way into the city of Adelaide. Hundreds, thousands of sheep in them. And yet the average Australian can't afford to eat them. Look after Australia first. Then, any excess we have that is not needed for our population, right, that can be sold to other countries. In my opinion, not in live form, because I think it's cruel, but it can be exported to other countries and used for other countries after it's been slaughtered. Don't have a problem with that. But after Australia's been fed first, and this applies to every other country out there. My daughter was telling me a story. She read an article not long ago whereby in England they pick, they harvest the apples, and then the apples are sent, can't remember whether she said the Middle East or Kenya or Egypt or somewhere, where those apples are sent there. They're sorted, they're cleaned, they're sprayed with that wax crap they put on them to make them last forever, and then they're sent back to England and sold to the British public. Why can't they do all that in England? They could, but it costs a bit more, so they don't. Problem is with that is when something like this happens, there's no one in England to do it. No one's set up to do it, because it's usually done overseas, and yet they can't send it overseas. So what happens? All those apples rot on the ground or rotten dumpsters at the back of factories or whatever, because they can't be processed in the normal way. Whereas if England did all that themselves, they wouldn't have to worry about it. And these are just isolated incidents. This happens all the time. I used to be the manager of a distribution centre for a chain of stores that are the equivalent to, we call them cheap shops, but I think they call them pound stores or dollar stores or $2 stores, whatever. But we all know what they are. They're cheap shops. And you go into these cheap shops, and 99.9% of the stock in there comes from China, and is cheap, and is plastic rubbish. And most of the stuff that is sold in those stores is not necessary. No one needs it. Most of the stuff that's sold through those places is sold just because people want it, not because they need it. And most of it, and I know from over 10 years of being a manager, as I say, a distribution centre, I know that most of it is crap, and it ends up in landfill in less than 12 months. It is absolute garbage. Occasionally you get a good product come through, but I guarantee you they're few and far between, and I've seen millions and millions and millions of these products go through a warehouse and get distributed to stores, and I guarantee you they're somewhere out there in the dumps of Adelaide as landfill. And why do we do this? To keep costs down, because people can't be bothered to spend the money, and that annoys me. I would rather pay twice as much for an item that's better quality, that I know will last, is made here in Australia, is distributed in the country, whether it be from one state to another, it remains in the country, and is made with our own raw materials. Because someone has to gather those raw materials. Someone owns the place where the raw materials come from. And they pay people to chop it down, get it out of the ground, to make it. Okay, and then they pay a truck driver to take it to a factory where it's made into a particular item. Okay, and while this is going on, there's another factory somewhere else that's making the packaging for that. Okay, and then it all comes together in one product that ends up going in a truck to a distribution centre. Then it ends up going in another truck to a store where you and I can buy it for twice as much, but it'll last 10 times longer, actually do what it's supposed to do. And what have we done? We've employed numerous truck drivers, numerous people at a factory that manufactured it, people at a factory that manufactured the packaging, the people that provided the raw materials for the packaging and the product, and all these people have a job in Australia doing that. You buy this cheap crap that ends up as landfill from overseas, and all those people suddenly don't have a job. And that is wrong. You need to look after your country first. So if your country has products that it excels at, or that it can make, even if it's at greater expense, then you owe it to your country's economy, to your people, to your country and your people's survival. You owe it to them to make that product and to buy that product. Okay? And labelling on those products needs to change to reflect that. None of these loopholes that say, oh, if it's certain percent of the product comes from Australia, then you can say it's Australian. No, 100% comes from that. And that's the only way you get the Made in Australia logo. Anything else, you have to have a different logo. Okay? And, you know, there are very few things that we here need to import. Atlantic salmon is a good example. We don't have Atlantic salmon in Australia. Apart from anything else, the Atlantic Ocean doesn't touch our shores. Alright? So we have to import that. We don't have any choice. Okay? But there are very few things that fall into that same category as Atlantic salmon. This country, when I was a kid, we had a Toyota factory, a Mazda factory, a Ford factory, and a General Motors factory. We don't have any now. The last one was the General Motors factory here in Adelaide that shut down a couple of years ago. Thousands and thousands and thousands of people out of work from those car manufacturers, and you can't get an Australian car anymore. No such thing. You have to buy some cheap tin box that comes from Korea or India or somewhere. You know, you slam the door on one side and the rear vision mirror falls off the other. You know, they're rubbish, absolute rubbish, and you can feel the difference when you drive one of those cars as opposed to one of the Australian made cars. And you people that are in America or Europe, Britain, you all know exactly what I'm talking about. You may be able to get your Hyundais and Daewoo's and all these sorts of vehicles at a much cheaper price. But you get behind the wheel of an Australian vehicle, European vehicle, an American made vehicle, and you notice the difference. They're solid. They actually feel like they're going to stay in one piece and not fall apart. When we first started driving, we would drive, our first cars were 20 years old or more. Can you imagine one of these modern cars? You know, a Kia or a Hyundai being 20 years old? They don't last that long. You're lucky if they last half of that. You know, why are we doing it? We're doing it to save money. But at what expense? Expense of job losses, untold number of job losses. And it also means that your country, in a crisis, cannot be independent. Not for a long period of time. And you need to make sure they are. don't get me wrong, and I agree with what Bev said. World trade is very important. I'm not saying no world trade. Definitely world trade. Don't have a problem. Fantastic. Okay. But it's like Vietnam. When all this broke out, the first thing Vietnam did was they stopped the sale of rice to outside countries so they could make sure they could feed their people. Brilliant idea. Absolutely brilliant. But it meant countries like us, the rice disappeared off the shelves in the supermarket. We've been told that the price of rice is going to skyrocket. Because yeah, we do grow rice here in Australia. It's grown in Queensland. But we don't grow anywhere near enough for the country. We could, but we don't. Because it's cheaper to buy the Vietnamese rice. If they sell it to us. Which they do normally. But under these current conditions, they're keeping it for their own people. And rightly so. But we can't get it now. We can't be the only country that's in that position. And there are so many other things like this. So, I appeal to you all to think of your own countries first. If you learn nothing else from this pandemic, it should be that. Is you look after your own country first. And you can email a link to this video to your local MP if you like. I'm going to leave in the description below the link to Bev's video. Go and have a look, see what she's got to say. She probably explains it a lot better than I did. Send her link as well. So that maybe these morons will stop worrying about lining their pockets. And when I say lining their pockets, that's not strictly true. I don't mean lining their pockets. I mean they're more worried about their reputations and staying in power. That's what they do. No one wants to make a controversial decision. No one wants to be the one to suddenly make Australians pay $2 more for a packet of rice than they currently pay, by making Australia grow their own. But if they did, we wouldn't be in the situation we are now where we can't get hold of rice. We'd have rice. And if we did it wisely, we'd have excess rice. And the same as with the lamb. When you have excess, that's when you can sell it on to another country. That's when you can say, look, we've filled our quota here, we can sell it on to other countries. And then you make your money. Okay. So, that's the soapbox for this week. I've probably bored you all rotten. But still, it's what I feel passionate about. So, all my Australian viewers, Advance Australia, to all you other viewers around the world, wave your country's flag. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any other videos. And until next time, it's goodbye from Hilltop Farm. See ya!